Remember what Montesquieu said: countries are well cultivated not as they are fertile, but as they are free. Sometimes it's good to remember that, but we forget it because of all the clutter thrown at us by hyperactive media. Cleaning out your mental inbox. This is the Daniel Natal Show. Selwyn Duke has an interesting article on the New American website entitled "The Left is Further Dividing Us and Stoking Civil War." In it, he writes, "Imagine that spouses in a marriage increasingly lived separate lives, socializing with different circles of friends, eating dinner apart, watching TV in separate rooms, and avoiding substantive discussion because they found it impossible to talk matters out. Wouldn't you suspect they were heading for a breakup? Now imagine that much of the division resulted because one spouse banned the other from his circle of friends, dinner table, and TV room, and refused to discuss differences rationally, instead preferring to just hurl names. Whom would you most blame for an impending separation? It used to be that while Americans were divided by party, they generally interacted together in other arenas such as church, community organizations, and social clubs. The modern versions of social clubs writ large are social media." Mr. Duke then goes on to describe how President Trump and Dan Bongino have been deplatformed and censored, as well as millions of other conservative Americans. Last week I myself was looking at all the censorship and I asked the sarcastic question: if the media sees its main job not as relaying information, but as suppressing it, why do we call them the press? Shouldn't we call them the suppress? But the wider question Mr. Duke asks is about the left further dividing us and stoking a civil war. The dynamics leading up to that may interest you. First of all, it might be good to point out that we have a purposely divided government. This was handed down to us by the Romans, who did this to purposely keep kings from adopting too much power. So since the time of King Tarquin, they set out to create a separation of powers. The United States followed suit by crafting an almost purposely inefficient government to ensure that a dictator could never amass uncontested power. Too much centralization would make this easy, so we decided to decentralize the government and pit the House of Representatives against the Senate and the Senate against the presidency. While this is good for tamping down on the autocratic ambitions of would-be dictators, it does have costs associated with it. Thomas Hobbes in his political classic Leviathan said back in the 1600s that one of the downsides of a republic is that its divided government model conduces to internal power struggles. In a monarchy, he says, everyone knows who's in charge, the king. In a republic, however, where anyone can amass political power, parties jockey for position. They sabotage each other, and sometimes even the country. This is why, says Hobbes, republics tend to go to war. The only time they're at peace is when they have an external enemy. So because of the turbulent internal dynamics, they rely on war to keep the country together. So republics are almost constantly at war. The United States has largely conformed to this rule. In times of peace, we have had the bad habit of fracturing. In John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, he gives a history of the Senate. In it, he talks about the balance of power inside the government and how it was always thrown off when we acquired new territory. For instance, the Louisiana Purchase. While it doubled the size of the country, it also caused a power struggle when new states were admitted into the Union and the balance of power in the Senate was jostled out of equilibrium. We almost went to civil war 5 times before the official Civil War in 1860. Henry Clay, in one instance, narrowly avoided an earlier civil war with the Missouri Compromise. Before he hashed out a truce, both North and South were tempted to go to war over who controlled the new state. Henceforth, whenever new territories were added to the Union, they tended to do them 2 at a time, one going to the north and one going to the south to maintain the balance of power. Whenever a single state was added, for instance, California, it messed up the balance of power and once again there was talk of civil war. This is why it's so dangerous now, as the Democrats are trying to add Washington, D.C. as a new state. According to the Washington Post, with Democrats soon to assume control of both chambers of Congress and the White House, advocates of making Washington, D.C. the 51st state believe they are on the brink of a historic opportunity. 7 months after the House of Representatives passed a D.C. statehood bill for the first time, Mayor Muriel E. Bowser says the unprecedented assault on the U.S. Capitol adds to the urgency of the cause. D.C. residents, she said, risked their lives on January 6 to defend a Congress that affords them no voting representation. Knowing the history of the nation, this cynical attempt to get 2 more reliable Democratic senators is almost guaranteed to set off a powder keg. But the stress cracks dividing our nation aren't just replicating the factors that led to the Civil War in 1860 in that sense alone. There are other variables that bear a striking resemblance to that time period. Starting at the beginning, it might be good to point out that according to Aristotle, republics are usually founded in agrarian societies. Because farmers lead a decentralized life, they tended to set up a fairly decentralized form of government. The Roman Republic started off as a country of farmers, just like the United States did. When we began, 92% of the population were farmers or in some industry related to farming. All our founding fathers were gentlemen farmers. Of course, today, less than 1% of our population are farmers. The sociological dynamics naturally conduce to a change in political dynamics. Alvin Toffler pointed this out in The Third Wave from 1980. He observed that the Industrial Revolution produced profound effects on our society. For instance, we went from a decentralized society of farmers to a highly centralized nation of factory workers. In the farm, he said, people are self-contained, isolated. If you screw up, it doesn't affect anyone else. In a factory, by contrast, if a person makes a mistake, it affects everyone else up the assembly line chain of people. Because of the interdependence of this new system, a hierarchical bureaucracy evolved to oversee the people. Just as our workplace was affected by this structure, so was our government. As the culture changed, so did the political system. Just as in the factory with lots of middle managers, our government acquired a vast new bureaucracy, which we call the deep state. They started infringing on all sorts of freedoms to manage the society. Thus we morphed from the republic we had been to a new administrative state. We were run less as a country than as a business. Citizens were replaced by consumers. The people running the bureaucracy didn't see themselves as our servant, but our masters. As farms died and people flooded into the urban areas of the country, the demographic dynamic shifted too. In the first Civil War, it was largely a fight between the agrarian South and the industrialized North. Look at the emerging bifurcation today. It's very similar, with the conservatives in what they call suburban flyover country and the left operating out of the cities. Just as in 1860, the industrialized North saw the South as backward, ignorant. Just so the radical left today, that sees the people in the heartland as knuckle-dragging cavemen. Two different cultures have emerged. In the 1920s, social scientist Talcott Parsons said that there are two very different ethical systems relative to whether you're from a productive society or a consumer society. In a productive society, he said, like the kind that farmers make with republics, the values of hard work, thrift, and fair dealing are promoted. In a consumer society, by contrast, vices are promoted. Luxury, wastefulness, prodigal behavior, nihilism, and hedonism. So the left and right are operating according to two very different operating systems. This is dangerous, because as the Russian historian Peter Turchin points out, a society needs a common ethical structure to be able to remain cohesive. He said that it's no coincidence that the first large empires happened in the so-called Axial Age, when religions emerged, in 800 BC. For the first time, what he called a cooperation zone, or what we call an empire, emerged that broke the million-kilometer threshold. You had Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, etc. It doesn't have to be a religion per se. The Roman Empire had Stoic philosophy. The point, though, is that a common ethical structure is needed to overcome differences in race, language, or culture. Without this, everything unravels. According to Sir John Glubb in The Fate of Empires, the average lifespan of an empire is 250 years. This represents roughly 10 generations, he says. At the beginning, the manly virtues are promoted: strength, honor, industry. As time goes on, however, and the succeeding generations forget the lessons of their forebears, they succumb to weakness, effeminacy, and ignorance. If you subtract the year 1776 from 2021, you get 245 years. Now, since the atomic bomb made conventional war obsolete, and we haven't been in a declared conflict since World War II, you can see that as a republic, our fractious internal dynamics might be a cause for concern. Without an external enemy, we tend to go to war with each other. And as the demographics change, and as our common culture erodes, there is little to hold us together as a coherent nation, which is why Lord William Rees-Mogg predicted in The Sovereign Individual that large nation-states would start breaking down, and we would revert to a medieval model of city-states. Look at all the so-called sanctuary cities that have started popping up all over the place, declaring themselves immune to federal law. Who knows if when future historians look back, they won't declare the Second American Civil War as having started when California declared itself a sanctuary state, much as in 1860, when South Carolina seceded from the Union. The point is, to get out of what's coming, we have to make a strident effort to hold the country together, to reaffirm the beauty of our heritage, and to unapologetically assert the majesty of the American experiment. What we require is a moral revolution. 2 times in history, this restored the ethics in the people and brought the society back from the brink. It happened once in the Byzantine Empire and again in China when Confucius saved his society by reasserting a moral revolution. We can do this. It will be hard, but it can be done. The only question now is, are you up for the challenge? People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming. And don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.